I wanted to welcome everybody to the PHIS Export Technical Meeting. We've had a lot of feedback from folks that they had a lot of questions about the importance of batching and how folks will be hooking up and doing that. And so we have an all-day agenda. We want you to ask questions as we go along. We'll have specific pieces that we're presenting on the entire batching and connecting to web services and all those pieces that are involved. So we want you to ask questions. We have all day scheduled, so I think it is important that you speak up either in the room or on the phone, again, if you have any questions. To start this piece, which we feel is a very, very important component to the whole PHIS application, the export module, our Deputy Administrator, Ms. Carmen Rottenberg, is going to give us some opening remarks, and then we'll be going from there. So, Carmen?
Thanks, Bill. And thank you to all of you for participating today, and for those of you on the phone. As most of you know, we had our first session on the PHIS export last month, which focused on an overview of the rollout. This is a continuation of that meeting. We heard from you that there was a need for bashing, and so we are committed to answering your questions today. And those of you on the phone can't see, but I think that we have about half of our IT department here. So if we can't get answers to you today, I don't know when we'll be able to. And that really shows our commitment to all of you through this process. This upcoming change in PHIS means that the export application and certification system will be as an alternative to the paper-based process that we've been using for many years. The final rule was published in June of 2016 with an implementation date of June 29, 2017. And so this summer's phased-in implementation will include 19 countries, which translates to less than 5% of exporting countries. And I know Bill has talked to you about this before, but the phased implementation approach is really important. And we're beginning with the phased-in approach so that industry can gain valuable experience and so that FSIS can continue to communicate next steps and feedback. Eventually, when we fully implement the system, it'll be fully implemented for we really, as Bill mentioned, need feedback from you today, and so I want you to not hesitate to share your thoughts. Some of you have done that offline. Some of you have asked questions that have been answered but have been kind enough to submit them today to Carol and Bill so that we can go through these. And really, if Al Almanza was able to be here today, he would have been, because he really does want to communicate to all of you that this is how to get these technical questions answered. And let's get this finalized so that we can do what we need to do on our end and work with you to successful implementation of the export. So the update to this export update will make for a more efficient system with our partner countries, and it's a prime example of how we're modernizing at FSIS. This public health information system is a big part of what we have done, what Al has done in the time that he's been administrator and deputy undersecretary in terms of moving the stage and relying on this one system for the data that drives our decision making. We thank you for your time, and we look forward to continue to working with you so the transition module is as smooth as possible. So thank you.
So thank you, Carmen, for opening the meeting. A couple of points that we do want to, again, as Carmen said, that we had our first meeting back on February 14th, and we do have a planned implementation of June 29th, 17. When we've had conversations with a number of the folks, that has been the feedback we've been getting, that they really wanted to have the technical meeting to understand what new programming-wise. And so, again, we need to hear from you if that becomes an issue about getting programming done so that we can take that into account. There will be 19 countries, as Carmen said, and we will have a fair approach until we get to all 234 under PHIS. What's very important in that process is we'll be running two systems, as we've said all along, opening meeting with exports. So the system that is presently in place now will be in place with the phase-in process on the new. It'll be phased in a set of countries every so often. We want to get this first implementation going, run it for about 90 days, establish a firm implementation date so that we can learn and you can learn the process, and so that we can have a successful rolling implementation. It is very important that you understand we are going to have those two systems, and once we convert to a system, the newer system, there will be no ability to go back, and so that needs to be in your planning and thought process early on, because we've said. I had numerous questions coming in from the industry who said, well, if something doesn't work, we're going to go back to the old system. And that won't be an option because we can't go backwards to paper once we go do a full automation. So that needs to be in your thought processes also. So today's meeting, we're going to look at, present the technical specifications for batching and also the application process, permissions, how you sign up, and you can see from the agenda how it's going to be covered. And again, I encourage you to ask questions as we go. A couple key points that you also need to keep in mind: the security. We are enhancing security for the corporate piece, such that you can control the industry had asked for, both domestic and export, to have a corporate entity piece. That is a major part of this application that we're rolling out, but that means there's extra security that's going to depend on you as well as us to make sure that that works, and people, especially if they leave your organization, can't get back to your corporate structure. And so that we'll go through that. Another very, very important piece that we've said from day one, both domestic for the industry and is still important today, is the 90-day rule. So every 90 days, any entity that's coming into PHIS, and it includes the industry, if you don't, and at least once every 90 days, the system will lock out and you'll have to start the process all over. So again, that's a key security feature, but one that you must really communicate to all folks that are working with it. That 90-day rule is extremely important. Again, the backup system, PHIS has a fully resilient system. As I said earlier, once we commit to going to the new system, going back to paper is not really a good option. You will also have to be planning in case your system goes down with backup you would be using also. So those are some key thought processes as we go through today that you'll want to be thinking about and, again, asking us questions about. We broke, as you see on the agenda, we have various topics. There will be questions and answers after those. We don't have a lot of published breaks in there, but I guarantee we will take breaks. We won't go 4 hours straight through to lunch. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to Carol Spencer, and she'll lead us through today's events.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning, and I thank you as well for joining us in the room as well as on the web for our second webinar on the automated export application for the Public Health Information System. Similar to the February 14th webinar, it's our plan to have questions and answers after each presentation, like Mr. Smith just mentioned, and have a discussion at the end of the day. Some of you have submitted questions through the email box provided in the invitation letter. Those questions will be answered at the end of the day, along with a larger session to answer any questions that may come up. For those joining by the web, I believe you have the ability to submit or speak your questions. We have staff in the room that will read those questions for the web for you. For those joining us in the room, there are 2 microphones. Please feel free to use those and ask your questions. So now I'm going to introduce the panel that will respond to your questions throughout the day. We have Mr. Bill Smith, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Field Operations and the Executive Sponsor for PHIS. Mr. Carl Mays, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Investigation, Enforcement, and Audit, is serving as our consultant in PHIS batch process. A couple of subject matter experts that you should also be familiar with. We have Mr. Lyndell Johnson from the Office of Field Operations, Dr. Neil Westgerty, and Dr. Brian Seidel, both with the Office of Policy. And our PHIS contractor with Harmonia Holdings, Alexei Gasnikov is the system architect. So now I'd like to turn it over and start the presentation and introduce to you Ted Jameson, is the business analyst with Harmonia Holdings. We'll have a presentation on export batch process.
I'm going to be giving an overview of the batch export processing and just a little introduction. So the export batch process will be accepted to accepting information both by asynchronously data transfer to a web service.
So, you know where that's
They can answer by machine-to-machine web service or through the PA. As was actually mentioned by Bill, we have some new security methods that we're adding to the system. First one is just the web service authentication piece. That's for connecting to the web service itself. We also have the application access control, and that is to provide access specifically to an application where you can control access to each and every application. The batch processing will provide multiple response options for the status of those applications. There will be an option for doing it through a web API. There will also be email generated responses that will provide updates on the status through the web interface. Once the batch processor receives the data files, it will operate the same whether you do the upload through the web service or through the online process. There are a number of items that you'll need to collect and prepare for before you can actually start with the batch processing. First is you will need to have a level 2 EOS account. There will also need to be a user that has a PHIS ID as well as an assigned user role. And those 2 items are necessary to set up the service authentication piece. Some of the additional information is to complete the non-disclosure and the service account information, so industry owner and the manager and supervisor information for any entities doing the batch process. We'll also be doing IP authentication. So you will need to collect any machine's IP addresses so you can actually make the connection to the web service. The non-disclosure and industry service agreement, there's a page up on PHIS that needs to be completed for this step, and we'll be talking about that later. There's also going to be a generation of a username and password that will have to be integrated into the web service client that is created to connect to the web service. So we need to actually record that information for that program. There's the creation of the XML files that contain all of your application data. There's the XSD schema, which is what's going to be used to define your XML data files. It's going to be available up on PHIS. You will need to make careful note of the changes to the 9060-6 application fields. There are a number of new fields that have been added to the application. We'll be going over those later in detail. And so you will need to make sure you have access to all of those. Your system will need to be updated to define the application control for the individual applications. So you'll need to have the entity or user IDs that are now assigned to every user within PHIS. And your system will also have to create your XML files. For the actual machine-to-machine batch process, there will need to be a web service client created. So that application will need to be set up. That earlier username and password that is set up through the service accounts will need to be added as part of that client application, and you'll have to have access to those application XML packages that have been generated. This is a pretty simplified flow for what the machine-to-machine processing would look like. Applications will be generated and created into a data file. The web service itself will receive that data file and start processing the file, which includes, if it's a zipped up data file, they'll have to do the unzipping of that information, as well as breaking out the XML data from the application itself. The batch processor itself actually takes the application that exists from the XML and starts to process it into an application within PHIS. Once that application has been created and entered, then the application can then move forward for its actual processing. When the process of inserting that data into an application is complete, the processing status will be returned back to the applicants through a number of different methods. At this point, the batch process is actually complete, and it moves to the standard process for the approval. And so the implant personnel will review the applications for their determination. Once that determination is completed, then the status of the certificate or the application will be available through the online application grid. It will also be available. This is a overall flow of the details of the batch process that we will be following. We can go to the next slide and we can look at some of the details. The initial box here is showing just some of the industry steps that will be followed. Box number 3, what is the upload path? It just determines whether or not you'll be doing an upload through the machine-to-machine process or through the online interface. We're going to focus on machine-to-machine right now. Once the application actually has been uploaded to the service itself, the first thing that happens is the file type gets checked. We have to make sure that the files that have been sent are either XML or a zip file. Within the zip file, it can have an XML or PDF file for supplemental documents. So the number of steps that will have to be followed when creating the batch files. There's a application envelope, which is just some of the general data needed for the XML to manage the data within the file itself. And the product data, of course, is information about the products that are being sent. And then the final piece is the access control for the access to the specific application. Connecting to the web service, there is the authentication procedure that has to be completed. Once the files are being transferred, we actually begin a logging process where we are recording different milestones throughout the process. So pretty much at every step, we record a milestone for every completion that is finished. So we have that information to know if there's any issues. We can do some looking back to find out where the application may have failed. Beginning of the batch flow, PHIS has received the file, and we do some preparation of that file to get it ready for insert into PHIS itself. We're extracting the data from the XML file to get that information ready. We actually don't put it directly into PHIS. We actually put it into a temporary holding location as part of this process. We have to actually check and make sure that the XML data is formatted correctly. That's box number 14. Once we've actually completed that step, then we actually start taking that information and we insert the data directly into the PHIS application. And that starts the creation of the actual application itself. So the pre-processor is doing all of these different steps to make sure all the information is as we expect it. We're evaluating the different file types. We will generate actually an email response at the end of the process that provides an update. Another way to actually view the status of the application is through a web API. So those are a couple of the ways that we actually are providing information back throughout the process. We have to unpack the zip files. We do have a couple specific things about the zip files. The XML itself can be sent all on its own because that's just the application data file to create the application itself. If there are supplemental documents that have to be sent, they can have to be in PDF format, and there's a file size limit of it being 5 megabytes. You can have as many PDF files as you need to include, but each individual file has to be under 5 megabytes. Also, that zip file can contain multiple application XML files and PDFs. So it's not like you have to have a different one for each application. You can put them all into one zip file. And then, of course, we extract the data from the XML. This is really heart of the new batch process. This is all the steps that are happening within PHIS to create that application and get it ready for the implant personnel to review the application itself. There's a lot of steps here, of course. It largely follows what you would see through the actual online screens, so there's not all that many differences. One thing we do have to do is in box 17, does the application number already exist? We are providing an option to update an already existing file. So if an application has been created already, it is possible to go in and make adjustments to that before it's actually been opened by the implant personnel. So this does give an option to start an application and then come back and complete it later. So if there is already an existing application, we just have to be able to match it up to the original that was sent to us to make sure that we're updating the right information. The next box, number 18, is the application locked. This is referring to a step where the implant personnel have already started the review of the application to determine whether or not it should be approved. At that point, we cannot allow any additional updates to the application. It has to be locked down at that point. But up until the point they actually open up their task, it can be updated. After that, we move to the evaluation of the individual products. So we actually will look at each product line that's being provided, and we will insert that data into the application and repeat that cycle until the entire application has been populated with the products. And box 23, this kind of goes along with the being able to do updates. Is our application marked for submission? So some applications may be what you feel are complete, and so you will be able to mark it, have an indication within the application file that says, yes, process it all the way through to the end, so it will create that application and have it be ready for the implant personnel to review. If that happens, then we will charge a fee and run the application through the PHIS check to make sure that all the products meet the specifications. If there's a need to do an update, then we'll just bypass that step, and it would just go ahead and create the application and be ready for additional updates. At the end of it all, we will collect all of our information that's happened up to that point and use that to actually generate any response files back to the system in order to be able to know where the application is within the process. And that's box 29 to compile the response file for the batch. The batch application processor, so we pulling some of that regular application data into the application, obviously import-exporter products. So that's all normal. What's new here, of course, is mostly the access control for providing the access to the individual applications. So I mentioned the submission for approval. So we have the flag that will attempt to send the application all the way through to completion. In order for that to be successful, though, all the products must pass validation. And so most of those fields within the product XML do need to be completed to have that work. And of course, it has to pass the PHIS check. If an application is been submitted for approval, but there is a problem with one of the products, we will simply set that application back to unsubmitted status so that it can be later updated to completed format. So this is the end of the batch process. Box 3.4 in the bottom there, that is simply the response back to the applicant with whatever information we have on the status of the application. So it can be by email, or it could be by viewing the application online. Box 35, do the applications require updates? That just provides an option to go in and make updates to the application if there are any needed. And there's two ways of doing it. You can do it through the batch process, or you can actually do it through the online screens. Once the application has been submitted, the last step, of course, is for the implant personnel to go ahead and review that application, and at that point, the system is done. Next slide, please. So the results, email, the user interface, or API call. All the applications, after they've been completed, will actually show up within the application grid online, so you can view them there as well. The submitted applications to create the task with the implant personnel. And as I mentioned before, once the implant personnel do start opening that task and working on it, it will be locked from additional updates.
So we'll take a few questions.
Hi there, Shelley McKee with Unity. As far as the interpretation with the export library validation system, is there a way that the the implant personnel can override that if there's a glitch?
So this is Bill Smith. There is not a way to override. There's only really three major categories under the Elvis field that's going to be checked, and that's some of the new pieces that, again, we rolled out with the export module we did back on the 14th. So all products will be listed under a HACCP category, and so that's one of the checks. Then species, and then maturity. And the species and maturity are mostly for SRM controls, those kinds of. Those are the three things that Elvis will be checking against, and they are programmed in, and inspection personnel will not be able to override those. There's also features in there about whether it's electronic signature, a wet signature, but that'll be all, that's not really with the industry. That's a factor for the country, but that should be very clear in Elvis. Also, whether it needs to go to a PhD for signature, that'll automatically, all the signature and the PhD programs into the
comes from Judy McCabe, and she's asking whether there will be a fee charged for each application.
Yes, there will be a fee charged for each application.
The next question is there an option for electronic signature as part of the approval process?
The country dictates what kind of signature, either a wet signature or electronic. Where countries do accept electronic signature, that will be a feature in the PHIS.
The next question, if an application is submitted electronically but the submission is incomplete, can the user make changes manually?
This is Brian Final. Yes, an application can be updated or edited in the PHIS web-based system as long as it has not been opened and saved by the inspection personnel that'll be completing the export certification.
Just so they know what happens when the inspector does open it.
Yes, once the inspector opens the task and saves it, at that point, as Ted mentioned, the export task will be locked, or the application will be locked to the applicant. Therefore, they can make no further edits or adjustments. They will be able to delete or cancel that application, but they cannot edit the previously submitted information.
Okay, we have a question in the room.
So what happens if it's a catch rate item? So when you present it to the inspector first, you say, well, I believe I'm going to ship X. But you don't know what X is until you've actually taken away and calculate them, and then you typically go back to the application and correct it.
Well, that would have to be worked out at your establishment. You'd have to update the application prior to the inspector opening the task. You can create the application ahead of time, and you can let them know that, hey, this afternoon we're planning on doing export 7 to Guatemala or whatever. But if you still need to edit that and update the weight, then you will need to do that prior to notifying the inspector that you are ready for them to certify that export for shipment. Once they open the task and save it, once again, no further edits can be made to any part of that application. So if it's inaccurate at that point, then the inspector would either reject it, or the applicant would withdraw or cancel that application.
And today there's a lot of communication between PhDs, the inspector, and the establishment when they're getting the exports ready, what day they want the load to go out, what needs to be done, when is the inspector or PhD available. That's done today, and we don't expect that to change with this. We still want that communication between the establishment and the inspector. Coordinate what needs to be done and what day and so forth.
Okay, the next question is in the chat. If an application does not validate successfully through the product validation, when the application is processed a second time, will there be a second charge? For example, will the application go through box number 24 each time it is submitted?
So each time an application is submitted, there will be a charge, yes. And so if it's a resubmission, there will be a charge.
Okay, that's all we have on the chat for now.
Okay. Other questions in the room before we move on?
Typically is this fee?
I believe the current calculation is $4.03 per application, and we described in the final rule how that will be recalculated on an annual basis, but I believe it's $4.03 initially.
And we're still charged by the USDA inspector in-house, their normal fee.
Yes, for reimbursable inspection services and overtime services, those fees will not change as they are today.
So basically, at the warehouse level, that means I have to up my price in order to be able to be covered. Because you're not going to change the inspector's fee they charge normally, but you're going to put an additional fee on top of that.
Yes, there will be a fee for each application that is submitted.
Thank you.
Again, we would refer you to the final rulemaking, because all that is explained in there, how that fee was arrived at, and all those particulars. So we definitely encourage you to read the preamble as well as the rule itself, which gives a description of charges.
Questions, Nina?
There's one more, yes. At what point does the application become unable to be edited or updated? How do we know if it is opened by the inspector?
Okay, once the inspector opens and saves the task, at that point the application will be locked, and the applicant, if they go to the grid that shows the status and they try and edit that application, there is no ability to edit at that point, and they would realize that, okay, the inspector by default has opened and saved that task.
Okay.
On the grid, there's an icon that'll say unlock, and that goes away with once it's not able to get in and edit anymore.
This may be related, but the same person is asking, sometimes the final shipped quantity is not known until the product is actually shipped. We often have to adjust the number at that time. Is that still possible when the inspector starts the task and when it is locked, etc.?
Once again, all information needs to be final prior to the inspector opening and starting that task. As Lindell mentioned, we do expect communication to continue just as it does today. So when an applicant is ready for a shipment to be certified by PHIS, usually there's some form of communication that will let the inspector know that this product is staged and ready. We're ready for you to certify this for shipment. Prior to notifying the PHIS personnel, it is expected that the application would be completely updated at that point. Once they open it and start working on it, no further edits can be made. So, as I mentioned earlier, if there's still inaccuracies at that point, the application would either be rejected by the inspector or it could be canceled or withdrawn by the applicant.
I'm going to present a few features which are not specific to the export batch processing and which are general to every machine-to-machine communications with PHIS web services. It will be aspects about security, how to manage service accounts, and I will cover some technical details, how to establish communications between your client software and PHIS web services. So that high-level diagram depicts two aspects: how users communicate with PHIS website and how your machines could communicate with PHIS web services. As you see, we are going to use the HTTPS channel, which provides protection for data in transit for both user-to-website communications and machine-to-machine communications. Nothing special about the diagram, just two gateways, how you can submit your applications through the website UI and through machine-to-machine communications. Before I describe steps to create service accounts, I will explain why we need service accounts and agreements. To process applications, we need to authorize and authenticate and authorize clients first. For that, we use the same approach which we are using for user-to-website communications. We use username and password to authenticate the client, and we use assigned roles to authorize a client. That information is combined to what we call a service account. Service account is very similar to user accounts as they contain similar information: names, username, password, assigned roles. They also have expiration policy, etc., etc. What is not common, we request a security agreement to be accepted by authorized personnel before we enable machine-to-machine communications. That security agreement, which is called non-disclosure agreement, industry security agreement, and I will refer to it just as security agreement, it contains the terms of the agreement themselves. It contains IP addresses to enhance security and some extra information. And certainly you have to explicitly indicate that you are accepting the terms of the agreement before we enable machine-to-machine communications. So what kind of information we collect for that security agreement? You have to specify IP addresses from which client request will originate. So in addition to username and password, we want to authorize locations from which you initiate request. And it could be simple IP addresses, it could be IP address ranges, or something else like CIDR notation or whatever. As I told, it enhances security for PHIS and for you also. All requests which do not match provided IP addresses will be denied in the similar way as we denied unauthorized request. However, we will log all such requests and we will make that information available for you. So if your requests are denied, you can check service log and see what's going on. One note about dynamic IP addresses. Some companies might use dynamic IP addresses. It means such addresses could be changed from time to time. And if you have a different address the next time, your request might be rejected, and it will introduce some disruption in services. To avoid that, we encourage you to contact internet service providers, in this case to request static IP addresses. Or in some cases you can specify IP range to cover all variations. So the first step, you have to accept that agreement. And when that agreement is accepted, you can create one or more accounts. Usually it's enough to have just one account, but if you want to track requests separately, you can create more accounts. PHIS will generate username and passwords for you, just to ensure required level of complexity for passwords until something else requested by PHIS. What you have to do, you have to copy provided username and password and convey that information to your IT department so they could use this username and password for communications. Also, you have to assign roles to your service. As of now, we have only one role, expert batch submitter, so that step is simple. That picture depicts two common scenarios. How to create accounts, how to use service accounts. On the right side, you see just standalone organization, let's say establishment A. Service administrator accepts the agreement and creates one or more accounts. And these accounts are used exclusively by that establishment. That information is not shared, and only that establishment owns that account and uses it. On the left side, we demonstrated another scenario when you have a corporate organization for which we might have multiple establishments. Because PHIS considers all establishments as independent organizations right now, technically, you might be required to create service accounts for each organization. But that process can be simplified. In the scenario on the left, it's enough to create a few service accounts on behalf of one establishment and share that information within a corporate organization. All you have to do is just provide enough IP addresses and share username and password within your organization. That process we call sharing. Anyway, you're responsible for keeping that information in secret, as you usually do with username and password. PHIS provides the self-service portal to manage the security agreement and service accounts. On that picture, you see red zone and green zone. When the agreement has been accepted, or it is expired, or terminated for whatever reason, we consider that as a red zone. So all you will see just a page which explains that you cannot communicate with web services and instructions you have to perform to enable that communication. And multiple arrows just depict some actions and what happens next. So technically we just have a few pages which allows you to accept or edit agreement and create or delete accounts. That's all. That mock-up represents part of the security agreement page. The first section will be security agreement itself. It's a text. The second part presents information we have to collect while we enable machine-to-machine communication. So we collect industry owner name. It's a person who is considered as an owner for all service accounts. You have to provide manager, supervisor, contact information, and an important part is IP addresses. You can present them in multiple formats. As samples are shown here. The first line just sample IP addresses, the second line IP address range, and finally some net mask and address range in cyber notation. And when that information is provided, the final section provides a checkbox which has to be explicitly selected to indicate that you accept the terms of the security agreement, and an authorized user has to click that accept button. After that, we are moving to the green zone and we are ready to create one or more service accounts. We understand that information which you provided in the security agreement might be changed from time to time. For example, some owner, manager information could be changed, IP addresses could be changed. For that reason, we provide two features. Every time when something related to the security agreement is changed, you are required to edit that information and re-accept that security agreement again. In this case, you have to open the accepted security agreement and click Edit Agreement. After that, you change information as required and accept that agreement again. If you are not going to use your service accounts for some period of time, extended period of time, we encourage you to terminate the existing agreement. You can consider that as an extra security precautions. Terminate an agreement moves you to the red zone, so no one can communicate with PHIS web services using your service accounts and IP addresses. As soon as you need to resume that communication, all you have to do is just re-accept the security agreement, and all your service accounts, roles, etc., will be restored automatically. That slide explains some policies which PHIS applies to the security agreement and accounts, and which policies could be applied to organizations. The agreement itself, if there are no changes, has to be renewed every 3 years. So if you don't touch the security agreement, it will expire in 3 years. If you update the security agreement for any reason, that counter starts from the beginning and you have 3 more years. It can be terminated at any time for any reason. So again, it can be edited, whatever information you need to update. And the final statement just indicates that it's your organization's responsibility to keep service account credentials in secret and distribute them as required. At the same time, PHIS will apply the following policies. PHIS will review agreements and all communication aspects annually. At any time, if the terms of that agreement change, PHIS could terminate accepted agreements, and it means organizations will have to re-accept them again. Also, if something happens and the PHIS wants to stop machine-to-machine communications for an organization, that agreement can be locked by PHIS. Locking means that authorized personnel will not be able to accept, update agreement, or create new service accounts. So all communications will be terminated. That slide presents just steps which happens when you communicate with PHIS web services. First, as I mentioned, you have to have the service agreement accepted and you have to have at least one service account. Next, your client software has to submit valid credentials, which comes from your service account. PHIS will authorize location, client location, by matching client request IP address with IP addresses you specified in the agreement. The request will be denied if there is no match. And finally, we will perform authorization to check if that account authorized to perform a requested operation. All steps must be validated as true to allow the request to be processed by web services. It's a quick overview of technology we're using to create and maintain web services. So, as of now, web services which will handle expert batch requests are SOAP-based web services. It's a simple object access protocol, and we use Windows Communication Foundation platform from Microsoft, which allow us to create web services. And we support required level of interoperability because we understand that not everyone uses Microsoft, but everyone could connect and consume services, regardless of the technology behind the scene. Information about services, how to communicate with services, what is required, what is security policy, and other standards and protocols are described in an XML document which is known as Web Service Description Wizard document. That document uses special language, which is called Web Service Description Language, and it helps clients to create software to communicate with our services. All communication happens over protected channel. We use HTTP protocol and HTTPS. We host our services in Internet Information Services, and we use HTTPS. So all data in transit are protected. And we use X509 certificate as a requirement. And another aspect of the security I call IP address validation and username and password verification. And these steps are technical. I don't think we need to discuss them. They are related mainly to your IT teams. These are steps, what you have to do to create some proxy client to communicate with services. In most major languages and technologies like .NET, Java, you have some generators which will generate proxy service client for you automatically. You just have to specify a WSDL document or specify a valid URL from which you can request WSDL. And that information is provided to you by PHIS. And that software will generate all required code base. So it would be much more easy for you to start machine-to-machine communication. In rare cases, in very rare cases, you have to do something from the scratch and to create SOAP envelopes and do web requests manually. In most cases, it's not the case. So you generate proxy, you call that proxy, you provide username, password, you make the call, you process return result. Success, fail, or whatever. For .NET clients, we have reference software. We can provide the client implementation, reference client implementation in .NET. Maybe later we will provide the reference implementation using different languages. The next slide describes steps for other languages. As I told, there would be some technical differences, but the idea is the same. We use some generators to generate proxies. Or refer to documentation, or just ask us and we will try to help.
So we'll take questions in the room.
The question is, will the stamp number be available even if the application is not opened by the inspector or submitted? Otherwise, the inspection process cannot be started prior to shipment. After the shipment, the number of shipped QTY or establishment number of the product may change. Then the update may change, so it has to be submitted. It is still not clear how this can be communicated between the applicant and inspector. We understand that the communication needs to be there just like we do today. However, we have 9060-5 paperwork currently, and that is the time we update the info. PHIS will not have 9060-5 process, so we need to understand what stage on the 9060-6 process, what changes are okay to make, and when it will not be not acceptable.
Okay, so the 9060-5 is created in the application until the PhD or the inspector approves the certification or certifies the load. The final cert is not generated in the system. So at any time, the industry can get in and look at that application and make changes to that application, copy of it as it's created. Once they create and submit the application, yes, they will have access to the cert number. The cert number will be generated by the system and it'll be available for them.
Yes, each application will have the certificate number or application number. Once approved, that number will be printed onto the 9060-5. So on the front end, as soon as you submit an application, you'll get the number right away. And I think part of that question was if something changes after the product ships, the only way to accommodate that, just like today, is a replacement certificate to reflect the new information that is replacing the inaccurate or old information. And PHIS will accommodate replacement certificates very similar to the processes that replacement certificates are.
you. We have one more question. Will we be able to send the files via FTP to a secured site? Will we be able to send the files via FTP to a secured site?
Why not use an FTP? You have to submit your files through HTTPS to our web services. We don't support any intermediate location from which we collect files as of now. Is what the question? I understood it correctly? Did I understand your question correctly? You're asking about FTP,
Yeah.
some location, you want to drop files there, and
To a secured site.
yeah, we don't support FTP anymore. It was original procedure. You drop some files to some storage, and we access that storage using FTPS protocol, secure FTP, and whatever is there, we process.
Yeah, he said it just answered the question.
It's not working that way anymore. You have to push files explicitly to PHIS using web service.
Okay, I think you answered the question. Thank you. And then I think this is the same question we've been asked before. Will there be a fee charged when the change is made on the application?
If the application was submitted and then the applicant chooses to unlock it and make an edit, once they submit it again, there will be another fee charge. Edit the application prior to submitting it, there is no charge until they actually submit it, verification, and then ultimately a task for the inspection personnel.
Okay, that's all the questions we have on the chat.
Any additional questions in the room?
Okay, we just got one more on the, do we have one in the room?
Yeah.
Okay. Will an image of the 9060-6 PDF be required as part of the XML, or can the XML be data only?
I'm sorry. Yeah, on technical, all questions regarding specific information about XMLs, data structure, and everything related to export-based processing will be addressed by the next speaker, right, Matthew?
So it's going to be data only. You don't need a scan control.
That's all for now.
Any other questions in the room? Okay. And now we're moving to Marvin. Marvin Light, Branch Chief of the Network and Security Operations with the Office of Chief Information.
Okay, again, good morning. This slide here basically is to discuss the security controls for customer access to PHIS. I'll be focusing primarily on the physical security controls that are implemented. A quick intro before I go through the diagram itself. In preparations for PHIS export batching, during the past 18 months, the security infrastructure being presented in this diagram has been implemented in production to address the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of customer access to PHIS. End-to-end encryption is also implemented to protect the bidirectional communications between the client systems themselves and PHIS as well. And in addition, there's a multi-factor layered approach to cybersecurity of a variety of tools that consist of intrusion prevention systems, content analysis systems, web proxies, and firewalls. So starting at the diagram in the bottom lower left-hand corner, what we have is the PHIS industry user, and as briefly mentioned from the previous presenter, as you can tell that the URL itself is secure over the internet. The first security gateway, which is the upper firewall icon in the far left-hand corner, is responsible for doing a deeper inspection of the inbound request. It checks for security compliance. The second passing on that request provides the credentialing process for authentication and authorization. Upon providing the correct credentials, you're then passed on to the third security gateway, which from the diagram, it's a PHIS web gateway filtering system and scanning system, which again is a collection of various security tools that performs a deeper analysis of security risk. Once the connection passes the third security gateway check, you're then presented at the PHIS console with the assigned roles and permissions that were granted during the original account creation process. Below the PHIS system itself is another representation of a security gateway, and just wanted to make a clear explanation of this gateway. This firewall here controls the public-facing side of PHIS from the internal side of PHIS. And there's another collection of security tools that's in place that inspects deeply the traffic and communications inbound and outbound from the PHIS systems. Lastly, what's not mentioned in the diagram, but I wanted to make a reference to it, is there's a 24/7, 365 security operations center that is responsible for the monitoring, detection, prevention, and mitigation of security risk associated with PHIS, from the beginning of the end-user connection to the PHIS system itself. Although we don't mitigate the security risk on the end-user's computer, we are able to see any type of incoming traffic that may not meet the security compliance of PHIS.